A trucker picked up a homeless woman and her son on a rainy highway. With nowhere else to go, he offered them shelter by giving them the keys to his house. When he returned home that evening and stepped inside, he was shocked by what he saw. Tom stood in the doorway taking in the chaos of his room, a living monument to countless promises he'd made to himself to restore some semblance of order. Each morning, as the first slivers of sunlight broke through his window, he felt a pang of guilt over the mess surrounding him. He'd make a mental note to tidy it up, but in the scramble to prepare for work, that resolve would fade, replaced by the demands of the day. And each evening, after the grind left him worn down, he'd return to that same room, his hand instinctively reaching for the bottle of whiskey waiting on the nightstand. It had become his nightly ritual, the amber liquid a temporary escape that quieted his mind, just long enough for him to slip into a heavy, dreamless sleep. The next morning, the cycle would start again. In the quiet moments, Tom couldn't avoid the empty ache Emma had left behind. Her departure to chase her dreams in the city had left a hole in his world, a wound he couldn't quite figure out how to heal. "You can come with me, you know," she had said, eyes bright with excitement. But he'd only shaken his head, rooted in place by an unspoken fear of the unknown. Now, in her absence, he filled that emptiness with the comforting numbness of whiskey. Every empty bottle that lined his bedside table felt like a badge of some unacknowledged sorrow, a quiet testament to the nights he spent trying to drown out the memories of her laughter echoing through the house. He sighed and looked around at the cluttered room, each piece of mess almost mocking him, each pile of clothes and scattered papers mirroring the tangled emotions he hadn't faced. His promise to clean up became a metaphor for the promises he'd made to himself, to move on, to let her go, to start fresh. But somehow the weight of the past memories clung to him, holding him in place like chains he couldn't break. At the bustling fair, surrounded by the clamour of carnival rides and the chatter of families savouring homemade treats, Tom felt his world pause the moment he spotted Emma. She was leaning over a stall filled with colourful handmade candles, laughing with a warmth that seemed to brighten the whole scene. The sunlight caught her hair just right, casting a golden glow around her, and her eyes sparkled with a vibrant energy he hadn't seen before. Almost without realising it, Tom found himself moving toward the stall, his gaze locked on Emma, though he pretended to browse the candles with mild interest. In truth, he was drawn to the lively force she radiated, a magnetism that felt as real as gravity. When she finally looked up and noticed him, her eyes lit up with unmistakable joy. "Tom," she said, a delighted grin spreading across her face. "Emma," he replied, trying to sound casual as his heart pounded. Their conversation began with casual comments about the candles, but soon drifted to favourite fair memories, stories about mutual friends, and dreams for the future. Every word felt effortless, every laugh genuine, as if they'd simply picked up from where they'd last left off. Hours slipped by as they wandered from stall to stall, talking about everything and nothing, their connection growing with each moment. By sunset, the fairgrounds were alive with glowing lights and music, and Tom knew deep down that this wasn't just a chance meeting. It was the start of something special. Tom's presence had always been quietly magnetic. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a chiseled jawline and deep-set eyes, he carried himself with a calm, steady strength. His hair was tousled in a way that gave him a rugged appeal, but there was more to him than just looks. Beneath the rugged exterior, he had a depth and sensitivity that drew people in, evident in his thoughtful gaze and the way he listened with genuine attention. Though he rarely laughed, when he did, it was infectious, warming those around him. His voice was smooth and calming, giving his words a weight that made people feel truly heard and understood. Working across the vast expanses of Mr. Harrison's farm, Tom had become more than just a hired hand. He was an invaluable presence. Year after year, the rich soil yielded generous harvests, and it was Tom's touch that ensured the entire process, from planting to harvesting, ran like a well-oiled machine. Each morning, before the sun fully breached the horizon, he'd be out in the fields, methodically inspecting and preparing the machinery for the day's work. Tom's connection to the equipment was almost mystical. Tractors, combines, plows. There wasn't a piece of machinery he couldn't master. His understanding was instinctual. He could detect the faintest misfire in an engine's hum, identify a machine's need for adjustment simply by the feel of its vibrations through his hands. With a single glance or a touch, Tom could coax each piece to its peak performance, often resolving issues that baffled even seasoned mechanics. To him, the gears and levers felt like extensions of his own body, a language he understood without needing words. His expertise didn't stay confined to Mr. Harrison's fields for long. Word spread quickly among the neighbouring farms, and soon farmers began visiting to seek his advice or watch him work. "He's got a gift," they'd murmur, watching with a mix of admiration and envy. Some even joked, "Bet he dreams in engine sounds." And while some of the other workers tried to downplay his skills, their awe was unmistakable. But Tom was unaffected by the attention. For all his talent and the quiet respect he earned, he remained humble. He never boasted or sought recognition, preferring to let his work speak for itself. If someone came to him with a problem, he'd lend a hand without hesitation, often working late into the night if needed. One afternoon, as Tom worked on a particularly stubborn tractor engine, Mr. Harrison approached, watching him with a thoughtful look. "Tom," he began, breaking the quiet, "I don't know what we'd do without you around here." Tom straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Just doing my part, Mr. Harrison," he replied modestly, eyes cast down to his work. Mr. Harrison chuckled, clapping Tom on the shoulder. "Well, you've made yourself mighty indispensable whether you know it or not. You've got a way with these machines, and with people too. We're lucky to have you." Tom nodded, his smile lingering as he returned to the engine. He might not admit it out loud, but there was a quiet pride in knowing he belonged somewhere, that his work mattered to people. Tom lived a quiet, solitary existence. The woman who had nurtured him, his beloved grandmother, had passed just as he reached adulthood at 18. It seemed as though she'd held on just long enough to see him through his early years, her unwavering presence guiding him until he could stand firmly on his own. Her absence left a hollow space in his heart, but he found strength in knowing she'd instilled in him resilience and independence. In school, Tom often felt a pang of sadness mingled with frustration as he watched other children cry for their parents at morning drop-offs. Each tearful goodbye puzzled him. These kids would be reunited with their parents by day's end, yet they clung to them as if they'd never see them again. Tom never had parents waiting to embrace him, to soothe his worries or to cheer him on. No one ever explained why he didn't live with either of them, but as he grew older, the reasons became painfully clear. His mother had a string of relationships that held more allure than the responsibilities of parenthood, and his father chased material success and fleeting connections that left no room for a son. He was a casualty of their pursuits, lost in their worlds of personal ambition. Tom's school years painted him as a man of few words. He didn't engage in the idle chatter that filled the hallways or seek out the companionship of large groups. Instead, he found his solace in the school's workshop, where the hum of machinery provided a comforting rhythm. His hands moved deftly with tools, making intricate adjustments and breathing life into metal and engines. Mechanics and construction courses were his escape, his sanctuary, where he felt the weight of the world fade, replaced by the satisfaction of creating and fixing. What many didn't realize was that behind his reserved exterior, Tom held a deep love for reading, especially about world history. It was his secret pleasure, a private world he could retreat into whenever he was away from the clamour of school or the grind of daily life. He would listen in on his classmates' heated discussions about politics or historical events, quietly amused as they butchered facts he knew by heart. Yet, he never corrected them, preferring the peace of silence to the noise of debate. After high school, Tom's path was unmistakably clear. Though he appreciated the humanities, he felt he could absorb them through books, learning at his own pace. It was the hands-on work that truly called to him. So he enrolled in a local community college, immersing himself in courses on welding and automotive technology. When Tom chose to return to his quaint hometown after college, many were surprised. Most of his peers were drawn to the city's bright lights and promises of success. But Tom was different. He was content with the steady, familiar rhythm of his hometown, the sense of place that felt woven into his bones. He buried himself in his work, ignoring distractions and seeming immune to romantic overtures that came his way. He had a clear vision, to build a home of his own before he'd even consider marriage. The house he constructed stood as a testament to his skills, solid, practical, and filled with warmth. Tom poured his memories into every nail and plank, determined never to feel the sharp sting of cold or struggle again. Growing up, he had learned to live with little, watching his grandmother skimp on firewood to save money, leaving their home perpetually chilly. Building his own house was a promise to himself to leave those days behind. The day he first saw Emma felt like a page turning in his life. She was vibrant, full of life, and her presence seemed to stir a part of him he hadn't realized was dormant. As they began dating, Tom found himself captivated by her energy and laughter. Their love blossomed quickly, and it wasn't long before they talked about marriage, the promise of a future together shining in their eyes. For Emma, Tom was a rare find, a kind-hearted man who embodied stability and care, a breath of fresh air from the demanding life she led with her family's responsibilities. He was her chance to break free from the small-town life she'd always felt confined by. And Tom, infatuated and devoted, made every effort to fulfill her dreams, providing her with small luxuries she'd never known before. Emma quickly grew accustomed to this new life. Tom never hesitated to buy her what she wanted, spoiling her in ways she hadn't expected. He was a near-perfect spouse, handling everything with quiet determination and making sure she never had to worry. As the months wore on, Emma began to withdraw from household responsibilities, casually tossing out reasons like protecting her skin or simply not feeling up to it. Tom took it in stride, never pushing her, assuming these were small sacrifices he'd gladly make for her comfort. In his eyes, she was the love of his life, the only person left who mattered deeply to him, and he'd do anything to make her happy. For 3 years, Tom and Emma lived their quiet life, with Tom giving everything he had to make her comfortable. Then one day, Emma confronted him out of the blue. "Tom, how long are we going to be stuck here?" she demanded, arms folded tightly. "Everyone's moving on, heading to the city. We're just languishing in this village." Tom blinked, taken aback. "I never said I wanted to move to the city, Emma. And you haven't either. Why bring this up now?" Emma's voice sharpened. "I don't want to waste my whole life here, Tom. I hope you're not planning to keep me here forever." Tom raised an eyebrow, his confusion growing. "I don't understand. This is where we started our life together. We have everything we need here, don't we?" Emma began pacing the room, rolling her eyes. "My God, Tom, you sound like an old man. Don't you want more than this? Let's get out of here. See the world. Go to theatres for heaven's sake." The conversation escalated quickly. Tom's frustration finally bubbled over, and he snapped, "You're acting like a princess on a pea." The words hung in the air between them, harsh and stinging. Without another word, he stormed out, needing to cool off. They made amends later, yet the subject lingered in the unspoken space between them, never resolved. Unbeknownst to Tom, Emma had known he'd never leave town. In fact, she'd been counting on it, and this argument was just the beginning of her exit plan. 3 weeks after their confrontation, Tom came home from work to an empty house. Emma was gone. Only a letter remained on the table. In her note, she explained that she had found someone who truly understood her, someone with whom she was moving to the city. She ended her letter with a brutal farewell, claiming she'd taken the money Tom had saved, calling it compensation for the best years of her life that she'd wasted on him. Tom felt the weight of her words crush him, as if the foundation of his world had cracked in an instant. From that day on, his life unravelled. He sold his livestock and let the house slip into disrepair, neglecting the place he'd once built with pride. For a while he kept to himself, his pain hidden from view. But in a small town, silence never lasts long. And soon enough, rumours began to circulate about the man who once seemed so steady but now drifted like a ghost through his own life. Tom still dragged himself to work, but his behaviour had changed enough for people to notice. He'd been reprimanded several times for arriving smelling of alcohol. The day his supervisor called him in, he'd already emptied an entire bottle of whiskey, numb to the consequences. Returning home, Tom looked around his disordered house, feeling a dull ache in his chest. He'd tried to clean up once or twice, but each attempt ended quickly. First, he'd found one of Emma's hairpins, and later, their wedding album. Each discovery reopening wounds he thought had begun to heal. Eventually, he gave up on the idea of tidying up, resigning himself to the mess. When he stepped outside, the chill in the air stung his face, but he welcomed it. The biting cold seemed to ground him, bringing him a strange sense of clarity. His old truck, as usual, refused to start without a struggle. The battery was nearly dead. He'd been told to take some time off from work after his last no-show, so today he had nowhere to be, except for a liquor store. He popped the hood, sighing as he prepared to wrestle with the battery, when Mrs. Carey, his elderly neighbour, shuffled up the driveway. She lived alone across the street, and often seemed to be watching out for him. "They die faster in the cold, those batteries," she chuckled softly, crossing her arms against the chill. Tom raised his head, offering a faint, tired smile. "Hey, Mrs. Carey. How are you doing?" "Oh, I'm managing," she replied, giving him a once-over. "But you, on the other hand..." He shrugged, glancing at the truck before giving himself a quick, self-deprecating look. "Well, as you can see, I've seen better days." Mrs. Carey took a long, assessing look at him before sighing deeply. "Tom, she's gone. There's no sense in beating yourself up over it anymore. You deserve better than this." Tom looked down, shuffling his feet. He knew she was right, but the words stung, bringing up emotions he'd tried so hard to bury. "So, why don't you come in for a cup of hot coffee? It's freezing out here," she offered gently, nodding toward her house. For a moment he hesitated. The pounding headache from last night's binge made him want nothing more than another drink, but the thought of a hot cup of coffee in Mrs. Carey's cosy kitchen felt like a balm he hadn't realized he needed. "Yeah," he murmured, nodding. "Yeah, that sounds nice. Thanks, Mrs. Carey." They made their way across the street, and as he stepped into her warm, welcoming home, Tom felt a small spark of comfort he hadn't felt in a long time. Mrs. Carey set a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while. After a few sips, she spoke up softly. "Tom, it's never too late to pick yourself up. One step at a time, that's all. You've got people here who care, you know." Tom nodded slowly, absorbing her words as the warmth of the coffee spread through him. The Careys, both around 65, were a lively couple who'd refused to let retirement slow them down. Instead of settling into a quiet life, they took to the open road, driving trucks together to stay active and connected to the world. For years, they'd travelled side by side, working contracts with local suppliers, their favourite being a grain supplier who kept them busy through most of the year. But lately Mr. Carey hadn't been feeling well, leaving him grounded and unable to drive. Not wanting Linda on the road alone, they found themselves stuck at home. One chilly afternoon over coffee, as Tom sat in their cosy kitchen, Ben looked over at him thoughtfully. "Tom, how do you feel about going on the road with Linda for a couple of weeks, just until I'm back on my feet?" The next morning, Tom found himself beside Linda, running through a pre-trip inspection on their truck. As they set out on the open road, he felt an odd sense of purpose again. Days on the road with Linda's easygoing humour and lively stories became a reprieve from his grief. And soon enough, they were laughing and sharing stories as they cruised through towns and highways. A week into their partnership, however, Linda had to stay home. Ben's health had taken a turn and she couldn't bear to leave him alone. Tom didn't hesitate. He offered to finish the remaining trips on their contract, promising Linda he'd get the last loads delivered. One evening after finishing a delivery, Tom began his drive home in the middle of a storm. Rain lashed against the windshield, and gusts of wind rocked the truck, adding to the weight of solitude that crept back over him. As he drove, his thoughts wandered, and the familiar ache stirred, a longing for the bottle, a craving he'd pushed down but never quite shaken. He was already considering stopping at a liquor store on the way back. With 5 miles left before he reached town, Tom spotted something strange. Through the sheets of rain, a figure appeared on the side of the road, a woman, or perhaps a young girl, with a small child huddled closely behind her. The pair looked drenched and freezing, standing in the desolate dark stretch of highway. He felt a jolt of urgency. Slowing down, he squinted through the rain-soaked windshield and pulled the truck over, slamming on the brakes just a few yards ahead of them. "My God, what are you doing out here so early in this freezing cold? Especially with a child?" Tom asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and concern. The woman gave a vague shrug, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Are you headed into town?" "Hop in," he offered, trying to mask the worry in his voice. As they climbed into the truck, he glanced at the child who was visibly shaking from the cold. Tom fought the urge to ask too many questions, planning to simply drop them off wherever they needed. But the question nagged at him. What were they doing out here in the middle of nowhere? He couldn't shake it off, so he mustered the courage to ask gently, "Were you guys coming from somewhere nearby? I mean, is everything all right?" The woman hesitated, her gaze dropping before she replied, "Honestly, we have nowhere to go. Almost no money left either. Do you know if there are any places in town where we could find shelter?" Tom squinted, trying to make out her face in the dim light. She looked young, barely an adult, thin and worn down, and her tired eyes spoke of days, if not weeks, of hardship. His gaze shifted to the boy huddled against her side, couldn't be more than 5 years old, shivering and clinging to her. Tom glanced at his watch, considering his options, the hour making it unlikely that any place in town would be open to help them. They drove in silence for a few minutes until they reached his house. Tom pulled into the driveway, took a deep breath, and reached into his pocket. With a firm yet hesitant resolve, he pulled out his house keys and handed them to her. "That's my house just over there," he said, nodding toward it. "Take these keys. I'll be back after 6. The place should be warm, but if it's cold, you can stoke the stove. There might be some food in the kitchen, can't promise much, and the place is a mess, but it should get you through the night." The woman's eyes widened, the keys in her hand, as if she couldn't believe his offer. You're just giving us your house?" she stammered. Tom shrugged, trying to brush off the gesture. "It's just for the day. You look like you need it more than I do right now." With that, he left them standing there, watching as he drove off toward the parking lot. Strangely, he didn't give a second thought to the potential risks. In that moment, his instinct to help, born out of an understanding of loneliness and hardship, outweighed any fear or caution. The day drifted by in a fog for Tom, each hour blending into the next. It was only in the evening, as he found himself on the usual path to the liquor store, that a flicker of unease struck him. He bought his standard half-litre of whiskey, but, after a moment's hesitation, added a small bag of candies to the purchase. He couldn't shake the thought of the young boy he'd seen that morning, shivering and clinging to his mother. As he approached his home, he noticed a warm glow from the windows, an uncommon sight that made his heart tighten. Treading lightly, he peeked through a window, unsure what to expect. To his amazement, his usually cluttered and dusty living room was immaculate, each item in its place. The familiar chaos was gone, replaced by a cozy order he hadn't seen in years. On the couch, wrapped in a blanket, the young woman sat with the boy beside her, both immersed in one of his old children's books. A lump formed in Tom's throat as he watched them. Memories of a time when he'd dreamed of a family with Emma rose to the surface, bittersweet and raw. He had bought those very books years ago, intending to read them to children of his own. When Emma left, he hadn't been able to throw them out, though they'd done nothing but gather dust on the floor. The sight of someone actually reading them filled him with a quiet ache he hadn't expected. Then, the scent of home-cooked food reached him, warm and savoury. It stirred memories he hadn't revisited in ages, and he suddenly realised how long it had been since his house smelled of anything but dust and disuse. Glancing down at the whiskey bottle, Tom buried it deep in the snow outside before heading inside. The young woman sprang up as he entered, her cheeks flushed with surprise and a hint of embarrassment. "Hello," she stammered. I hope you don't mind. Johnny and I tidied up a bit, and I made us some dinner. You look like you could use it." Tom blinked, momentarily speechless, taking in the woman who, in the morning, had seemed like nothing more than a lost soul on the side of the road. Now she stood before him, not just grateful, but with an unmistakable warmth and grace he hadn't anticipated. "Dinner sounds great," he said, managing a smile. "I'm starving, actually." As she set the table, he crouched down to the boy's level, extending a hand. "I'm Tom. What's your name, big man?" he asked warmly, crouching down. The boy gave a small, shy smile as he shook Tom's hand. "Johnny," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well, here you go, Johnny," Tom said, handing him a candy bar. "Kids love sweets, don't they?" Johnny's eyes lit up as he glanced at the woman beside him, who gave him a gentle nod of approval. Only then did he accept the treat with a quiet, "Thank you." Settling at the table, Tom breathed in the aroma of the steaming broth in front of him, savouring it. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the warmth of the food sink in. When he finished his meal, he looked up, meeting the young woman's gaze. She watched him expectantly, as though awaiting his response. "That was incredible," he said, genuinely appreciative. "I can't remember the last time I had a home-cooked meal like this." She offered a modest smile. "Thank you. It's the least we could do after all you've done for us." A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. "Perhaps it's time for us to move on. We've already stayed too long," she murmured, her voice laced with uncertainty. Tom raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Are you in a hurry to get somewhere?" She shook her head, her eyes dropping to the table. "No, we don't really have anywhere urgent to go." Silence settled between them, and Tom felt the weight of it. He didn't know how to tell her that she didn't have to leave, not yet. She didn't need to keep looking for a place to stay, not when his home, quiet, empty, and in need of warmth, could provide them with that. After the meal, Johnny's eyelids were drooping, and Tom could tell the boy was ready to fall asleep. He offered to show them to the spare room, and she gently led Johnny, who leaned against her, down the hallway. When she returned after putting him to bed, Tom remained at the table pouring tea into 2 cups. He handed one to her with a nod, which she accepted, wrapping her hands around the mug. "Thank you," she said softly, her large, vivid blue eyes meeting his as she sat down. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the silence no longer awkward, but filled with unspoken understanding. "So, Scarlett, is it?" Tom asked, finally breaking the quiet, trying to ease into conversation. She nodded. "Yes, and thank you again, Tom. I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't come along." He took a sip of his tea, feeling a strange sense of contentment settling over him. "I'm glad I did. You two are welcome here, for as long as you need," he said, surprising even himself with the offer. Scarlett's eyes widened, her expression softening. "That's very generous of you," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. Tom simply nodded. "Please don't get me wrong," Scarlett began, her voice tentative as she stared into her tea. "We ended up like this because, well, life took a challenging turn for me." Tom nodded, listening carefully. "I was in school when I met a guy, thought I could trust him. It was a mistake, but I don't regret it because it gave me Johnny." She looked toward the closed door of the spare room, a faint smile on her lips. "When I went back home, my mother had a new boyfriend. He was younger, and she wasn't exactly thrilled about my return. I didn't realize it at the time, but I think she was worried about what her boyfriend thought." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Things seemed to settle a little after Johnny was born, but it wasn't easy. I couldn't really work while taking care of him, and relying on my mother for everything. It made me feel trapped. Then her boyfriend decided she was too old for him and thought I was a better match. I rejected him, of course, but somehow my mom found out. She blamed me for it all. Before I knew it, I was out on the street with Johnny." Tom stirred his tea slowly, his expression pensive. He could see the weariness in her face, the shadows of a difficult past she carried quietly. He set his cup down, looking at her with calm determination. "Scarlett," he said gently, "why don't you stay here a while, just until we figure something out? I'm rarely ever home, and the place, well, it's been empty for a long time. I'll do what I can to help you get back on your feet." Scarlett looked up, surprise and gratitude flickering in her eyes. "Are you sure? I don't want to intrude." Tom shook his head. "You're not intruding. Honestly, it's nice to have some life back in this place, and I'll see if there's anyone in town who can help with your situation." Over the next week, Tom's routine shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. His usual evening ritual of whiskey was nearly forgotten, replaced by evenings spent with Johnny, crafting small projects, or reading aloud from the dusty books that had once gathered on his shelves. There was a new warmth in his home, something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of family, of purpose, that he hadn't known he'd missed so deeply. The Careys had been pleasantly surprised to see the change in Tom. He'd come by one afternoon with a warm apple pie courtesy of Scarlett and thanked them for everything. Linda could hardly believe her eyes. Tom was smiling and even laughing. When he explained that, thanks to their job offer, he'd met Scarlett and her son, Johnny, the Careys exchanged pleased glances, happy to see him returning to his old self. At home, Tom's once empty house now felt warm and alive. Scarlett filled it with laughter and the scent of delicious dinners, and Johnny's bright energy brought a new joy to each day. It was the life Tom had always dreamed of, yet a quiet sadness lingered. He knew it could be fleeting, a gift that might not be his to keep forever. One evening, after a long day at work, he stopped by the store to pick up a few things. The shopkeeper, an older woman with a knowing smile, leaned over the counter, eyes twinkling. "So, she's back, huh?" Tom frowned, taken aback. "Who's back? What are you talking about?" "Oh, you didn't know?" she said, surprised. "Emma. She was here a couple of hours ago." Tom felt the colour drain from his face. Without another word, he dropped his groceries and bolted out of the store, his heart pounding as he thought of Scarlett and Johnny. He sped home, dread pooling in his stomach. Bursting through the door, he stopped cold at the sight of Emma lounging on his sofa, a smirk on her face. She struck a seductive pose, her eyes glinting with a mixture of resentment and amusement. "Where are they?" he demanded, his voice edged with panic. Emma pouted, crossing her arms. "Hello? Don't you even care that I'm back? Where's your excitement?" Her tone dripped with confidence, sure of her effect on him. But Tom's expression only hardened. He strode toward her, his voice low and fierce. "I asked you, where are Scarlett and Johnny?" Emma's eyes widened as he grabbed her arm, her bravado vanishing in an instant. "How would I know?" she stammered. "They left, probably back to wherever they came from." Realizing what she meant, Tom released her and turned toward the door, his jaw clenched. "When I come back, I don't want to see you here," he said coldly, not even sparing her a backward glance. Emma watched him, shocked. She had expected him to be overcome with joy at her return, confident that he'd never truly let her go. After all, he'd once loved her deeply. Without waiting for a response, Tom stormed out of his house. Panic surged through him as he realized that Scarlett and Johnny could have been gone for over an hour. Darkness had settled over the town, and desperation gnawed at his insides. Where could they have gone? He sprinted toward the Careys' house, praying they were home. The moment he told them what had happened, Linda didn't hesitate, rushing to get the keys. "Here, take it," she said, pressing them into his hand. "Let us know if you need anything else." "Thank you, Mrs. Carey. I'll be quick," he replied, his voice tight. The cold air bit at his skin as he drove around town, searching. It was a small place, and he knew there weren't many options for someone without a car, especially in this weather. The truck stop at the edge of town seemed the only likely destination, so he made a beeline for it. As he approached, he spotted them through the large window, two familiar figures huddled together in the warmth of the diner. Tom rushed inside, crossing the room in a heartbeat, and reached for Johnny's tiny hands, relieved to find them still warm. They must have just arrived. "Scarlett, what were you thinking?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Didn't you at least think about Johnny?" He pulled them both into an embrace, and Scarlett's tears spilled onto his shoulder as she clung to him. "I'm so sorry, Tom," she whispered. "She said she was your wife, that you loved her more than anything in the world. I didn't want to ruin your life. Please forgive me." A swell of anger at Emma rose within him, but he held Scarlett and Johnny tightly, focusing on their safety. As they sat, he ordered hot drinks, calming his nerves and explaining the entire story, the lies Emma had spun, the betrayal she'd left him with, and how everything changed when Scarlett and Johnny entered his life. Scarlett murmured apologies, but Tom only hugged them closer, his relief overriding everything else. On the drive back, the car was silent, yet Tom's mind was anything but. A sense of clarity settled within him, warm and steady. He realized with unmistakable certainty that he would do whatever it took to protect them. As he glanced at Scarlett in the rearview mirror, he felt an inexplicable warmth that grew with every mile closer to home. This was the life he wanted, and though he hadn't known how to ask her to stay, he now knew with every fibre of his being that he couldn't imagine them being anywhere else but with him. As they entered the house, Tom noted that Emma's demeanour had lost its earlier confidence. She glanced around, clearly aware that her presence was unwelcome. Tom gently asked Scarlett to take Johnny to his room and read him a book, shielding them from the confrontation that was about to unfold. The moment they were out of earshot, Emma wasted no time, pleading with Tom. "Tom, please, let's try again. I know I made a huge mistake. I didn't realize what I had until I lost it," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. Tom crossed his arms, eyes fixed on her with a cold steadiness. "Emma, how could you even think of coming back here after everything you put me through?" She faltered but pressed on. "I realized what I'd lost, Tom. The money I took didn't last long, and the life I thought I'd have, well, it wasn't real. The millionaire boyfriend. He was in debt and only worked as a driver. I'm living with my mother, scraping by with a low-paying job. I know I messed up. Can you forgive me? Let's start over." Tom shook his head, his voice calm but resolute. "I loved you, Emma. More than you'll ever know. You left me at my lowest, and it took everything I had to heal. I'm sorry, but I can't go back." Emma's expression hardened, her tone shifting from pleading to defiant. "Fine," she said sharply, "but just so you know, we're still legally married. That means I'm entitled to stay in this house, Tom. Legally, I have every right. And if I'm here, then they," she pointed towards Scarlett and Johnny's room, "have no right to stay. I can have them kicked out." Tom hadn't anticipated this turn of events, and he felt a surge of outrage as he watched Emma's demeanour change in an instant, cold and calculating. "This is my house, Emma," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I built it with my own hands. You left me and have nothing to do with it anymore. Do you really want to go down this road?" Emma's eyes narrowed, knowing full well that splitting the house legally would be a difficult and costly battle. But jealousy gnawed at her. The thought of Scarlett, a stranger who had somehow taken her place, was more than she could stand. Her expression turned vindictive. "Oh, I'll make it worth my while," she sneered. "I'll drag you to court if I have to. And don't think I won't make up whatever stories I need to." Her tone sharpened, and the threat was clear. Tom felt a chill. The last thing he wanted was a messy court battle, filled with rumours and accusations that would make him the subject of town gossip. He looked around, realising how many things in the house still reminded him of his painful past with Emma. Fighting her over this place felt like fighting ghosts. Suddenly, a strange calm washed over him. He met her gaze and spoke softly but with conviction. "You can have the house, Emma. I'll move somewhere else, start over. This place isn't worth dragging my life through the mud for. I won't give you the satisfaction." Emma's jaw dropped. She hadn't expected him to concede so easily. She wanted him to fight, to argue, to sink to her level, but his unexpected decision threw her completely off balance. She stammered, struggling for words. "Just give me a few days," Tom continued, unshaken. "I need time to make arrangements, and then we'll be gone." Without another word, he stepped out and made his way to the Careys' house, returning their truck keys. He shared with them Emma's sudden reappearance and his decision to leave the house behind. Linda and Ben were taken aback, surprised by his resolve. After Tom left, Ben and Linda exchanged a knowing look, both clearly thinking the same thing. They sat together discussing quietly, and by the end of their talk they had come to a heartfelt decision. The next morning, Emma awoke to find Tom and Scarlett quietly packing their things. The silence between them was charged with purpose, a clear sign that Tom's decision wasn't just a bluff. Everyone except Emma was seated for breakfast when a knock on the door interrupted the quiet hum of the morning. Tom got up to answer, finding Mr. and Mrs. Carey standing outside, a plate of freshly made pancakes in hand. Ben, with a gentle smile, ambled in, leaning on Linda for support. They greeted Emma in the living room with a polite but cool nod before making their way to the kitchen, where Tom, Scarlett and Johnny sat, sharing a warm breakfast. As laughter and conversation filled the air, Ben's face grew serious. "Tom," he began, his voice carrying a warmth and concern that silenced the chatter. "Why don't you bring your new family and come stay with us for a while until you figure things out?" Emma, listening from the living room, went rigid. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. It was as if Tom had slipped right out of her grasp, and the very people she expected to support her were now welcoming Scarlett and Johnny instead. 2 days later, Emma sat by the window, looking out at Tom and little Johnny shoveling snow together in the yard. Life in the house continued, though differently now. Tom returned to work and Scarlett took care of Ben, who had fallen ill along with Linda, who also wasn't feeling well. Meanwhile, Emma was left alone in the house. She slipped deeper into her own isolation, her anger turning inward as her bitterness grew. As the days passed, Emma began experiencing sharp stomach pains. At first, she tried to ignore them, dismissing it as stress, but the pain intensified. Weeks later, she received devastating news from her doctor: a tumour in her stomach. Her health rapidly deteriorated, her once confident demeanour withering as illness took hold. No one noticed her declining condition until the day an ambulance arrived outside the house. Scarlett, who was at home with the Careys, saw the flashing lights and rushed over as the medics emerged. After they left, she approached the house, hesitant but compelled to check in. She knocked but received no response. With a tentative push, she found the door unlocked and stepped inside. Emma lay in bed, her face pale, breathing laboured. Scarlett quietly fetched her a glass of water and sat beside her, sensing that, despite their complicated history, Emma needed someone in that moment. After a few sips, Emma's hollow gaze met Scarlett's. "Does your mother know?" Scarlett asked gently, unsure what else to say. Emma's eyes filled with something like regret. "No, she doesn't want anything to do with me anymore." They sat in silence for a moment, Scarlett's presence offering a quiet comfort that even Emma, in her bitterness, couldn't ignore. A faint, fragile connection formed between them, born not of friendship, but of shared humanity. In the final months of Emma's life, Scarlett found herself taking on an unexpected role as Emma's caregiver. The anger and bitterness Emma had once carried faded into resignation and vulnerability, and Scarlett, with her compassionate heart, stayed by her side. Tom often drove Scarlett and Emma to medical appointments, quietly supporting Scarlett as she faced this difficult task. Though Emma rarely expressed gratitude directly, a quiet understanding seemed to settle between the two women. On the day of the funeral, Tom walked through his old house, now empty of the ghosts of his past. He looked around, taking in the quiet stillness, and felt an overwhelming sadness, not only for Emma's life, but also for all the lost years, the choices made, and the pain each of them had carried in different ways. He realized that life's most important lessons often came at the cost of hardship and regret. It was a lesson he knew he'd pass on to those he loved, cherish the people who truly cared for him, and let go of what no longer served his happiness. As winter melted into spring, life began anew for Tom, Scarlett, and little Johnny. Tom and Johnny worked together, repainting the walls of the house, laughing and talking as they worked. Scarlett, with a noticeable bump growing in her belly, hovered nearby, sometimes helping, sometimes teasing them for missing spots. Though she grew tired quickly, she still bustled around, preparing meals and keeping the household running smoothly. The sound of laughter and warmth filled the rooms, a stark contrast to the once somber silence that had hung over the place. Tom and Scarlett had become like children to Linda and Ben Carey, who had never had children of their own. The Careys took to their role as surrogate grandparents with joy, doting on Johnny and eagerly awaiting the arrival of the new baby. One evening, they all sat together around a dinner table that had become like a second home. As they ate, Linda looked over at Scarlett and Tom, a soft smile on her face. "You know," she said, reaching for Ben's hand, "I think we always hoped to have a family, but we couldn't imagine it would turn out this way." "You three are a blessing we never saw coming." Tom nodded, a rare, contented smile breaking through. "You two have been more than family to us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We wouldn't have gotten through any of this without you." Johnny, beaming, held up his glass of milk. "To family," he announced, earning a round of laughter. Later that night, as Tom and Scarlett settled into bed, Scarlett rested her hand on her growing belly, looking over at Tom with a gentle smile. "I never thought life would turn out like this," she whispered. "After everything, it's hard to believe we're here, together, building a future." Tom wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "We're here because we found each other when we needed it most," he murmured. "And now, I can't imagine life any other way." In that small, cozy house, surrounded by the love of their family and friends, Tom, Scarlett, and Johnny began a new chapter. One rooted not in the pain of the past, but in the hope of everything yet to come. And, as spring bloomed around them, they stepped into a future filled with promise, love, and a newfound peace that had once seemed out of reach.